Hello, this is Dennis Polis with another Open Philosophy video. In this video, I'm responding to a request by the Dutch philosopher to make some comments on the simulation argument. The simulation argument was published by Nick Bostrom and argues essentially that we are simulants instead of real flesh and blood people. Let's see how the argument works. Bostrom argues that one of three possibilities is true. First, that the fraction of human-level civilizations that reach a post-human stage is very close to zero. Second, that the fraction of post-human civilizations that are interested in running ancestor simulations is very close to zero. And third, that the fraction of all people with our kind of experiences that are living in a simulation is very close to 1. Now you may very well ask why this last possibility is presented. And the reason is that Bostrom believes that simulations which are sufficiently fine-grained, let's say down to the neuron, or perhaps down to the atom if that's necessary, will have all of the properties of what is simulated. This is a widely held belief among naturalistic philosophers, and I'll come back to it later. The argument has some other premises. First, that a post-human civilization will have practically unlimited computer power, so that if someone desires to simulate their ancestors, they will be perfectly able to do so. Second is the so-called principle of indifference. It states that if there are many possibilities and we have no reason to prefer one over the other, then we should give them all equal probabilities. Thus, given the three possibilities, that there will be no post-human civilization, or that we will survive to a post-human state but not be interested in simulations, and finally that we will arrive at a post-human state and be interested in simulations, then we should give each of these a probability of 1/3. Thus, the probability that our descendants will simulate human beings is 1/3. This brings us to a final premise, namely that there are other civilizations like ours scattered throughout the universe. The probability of one of them surviving to a post-human state and being interested in running simulations is very high, almost 1. And if they run a large number of simulations, the probability that any given person, quote-unquote, will be simulated is much larger than the probability that that person will be real. This leads to the conclusion that the average person, you and I, for example, is not a flesh and blood person, but a simulant. For the moment, let's assume that the argument is sound, and play the game. The Dutch philosopher has asked me to answer 3 questions. First, would the simulation argument warrant disbelief in God? Second, would it make atheism irrational? Third, what about the problem of evil? And then he's left it open for further comments. Before we can begin answering these questions, we have to take a little bit of time to consider what the real world is like if the simulation argument is true. First of all, we don't know if the laws of nature which we observe in our universe are those which exist in the universe of our simulators. Our simulators could be trying out various sets of laws of nature, and they could be trying out various histories and biologies to see which work and which don't work. So what can we say about reality, given that we may not be in reality? First of all, we can say that our simulators have intentions, and they have a physical substrate in which they're working. That's part of the simulation argument. We're assuming that there are computers with enormous power which are implementing the intentions of our simulators. However, we cannot assume that any contingent physical facts, including facts about physics and the laws of nature, very fundamental facts, are true at the basic level of reality. Still, there must be laws, because if there were not laws, computers could not operate properly, could not be programmed, and could not be relied upon. There are also beings with intentions. And if there are beings with intentions, those intentions can be loving or hateful or indifferent, and so there is some moral structure. This is enough to allow us to answer the questions that the Dutch philosopher has asked. The proofs for existence of God can be divided into two categories. There are those which are hypothetical, like Paley's argument from design, in which he hypothesizes that God is the designer. These kinds of arguments are subject to counter-hypotheses, such as that offered by the theory of evolution. There are other arguments, however, which are essentially metaphysical and which depend only on very fundamental facts. For example, my argument, which I give in video 15, based on the laws of nature, would apply equally well in the world of our simulators as it does in ours. Why? Because it doesn't depend on any particular instance of the laws of nature. It only requires that there be laws of nature which operate in a consistent way. In the same way, arguments which depend on existence, such as that from contingency and necessity, and so on, would apply equally well at the fundamental level of our simulators. So, the logical, data-driven arguments which have been used classically to show the existence of God will apply just as well if the simulation argument is true or false. On the other hand, arguments driven by scientific data, such as Paley's argument from design and the fine-tuning argument, might not apply, because the facts might be different. The problem of evil, on the other hand, becomes very much simpler. There's a good answer to the problem of moral evil. If God wanted loving creatures, then he must have creatures who have free will. We must be free to give love or not, because love which is not freely given is not genuine love at all. So if we are free to give love, we are free to withhold it, and withholding love is the source of moral evil. On the other hand, physical evils, earthquakes, floods, typhoons, volcanic eruptions, and other kinds of disasters are much harder for us to understand and explain because they are directly due to the agency of God and his laws. If the simulation argument is true, all of these physical evils reduce to examples of moral evil, because they are our simulators allowing us to suffer these various affronts and pains. This is a moral choice on the part of the simulators. In this section, I'm going to play the game and assume that the principle of substrate independence, that it doesn't matter how we implement consciousness, is true, and focus on two problems with the argument. The first is the principle of indifference, and the second is a fundamental misunderstanding of what is involved in simulation. Let's begin. As you recall, the principle of indifference requires that if we have a number of mutually exclusive alternatives and no reason to prefer one to another, then we should assign each an equal probability. Thus, the three alternatives which Bostrom presents each get a probability of 1/3. Now let's conceptualize the problem in a different way. Suppose that we first consider the probability that we'll have a post-human civilization. Then obviously the probability of a post-human civilization is 1/2. If we then consider the probability that the post-human civilization will be interested in simulations or not, then the probability again will be 1/2 for each option, giving us a net probability of 1/4 for a post-human civilization which is interested in simulation. Any principle which is capable of giving us contradictory answers, depending on how we formulate the question, is unreliable. Thus the principle of indifference cannot be relied upon, and actually gives us no facts at all about the probability of future events. We should simply admit that we have no idea of what the probability of a future civilization simulating us is. Nick Bostrom seems to be under the impression that all that is required for a simulation is raw computing power and possibly a knowledge of the dynamics. But that's not the case. Anyone who's studied physics knows that in addition to the dynamics we need a knowledge of initial conditions, and the same is true in simulations. However we program the transition from one event to another, it is the starting events which will determine the outcome. Unless we start at the right point, we can't be assured that we'll get a reasonable result. Let's consider two approaches. First, we could start by programming the contents of each simulant's brain to mock past memories so that we could start at any arbitrary point in time, let's say yesterday. Then all of our memories before yesterday would simply have been preloaded by the programmer. The problem with this approach is that we have to get the memories to agree with each other. The memory of every single person is related because we share memories of common events. Thus, there is an enormous amount of work to be done in making sure that all of the brains involved agree with each other. While a future civilization may have practically unlimited computer resources, there is no reason to think that it has practically unlimited time. Who would want to devote themselves to painstakingly constructing the mind of any of 1 billion or 1 million or even 1,000 individuals when there are hundreds of millions of neurons to be programmed? This is an unreasonable approach. The alternative is to start back at the Big Bang and simulate the entire universe. If we do this, then we can be assured that if any humans or human-like creatures evolve, their consciousness would agree with the events. However, the problem is that we're not sure that any conscious-like creatures will evolve. Why? Because the dynamics of the universe are chaotic. Let's think about it. A butterfly's wing flapping in Brazil can change the weather in New York City. And there is no way to predict this. The entire universe has chaotic dynamics, because the dynamics of the universe is essentially nonlinear. If running a simulation from the Big Bang onward does not produce conscious humans, then we have to start over again. But we have to start over again in a random way, because any small change that we make, any tweak that is designed to bring us closer to the objective of conscious beings, doesn't necessarily get us any closer than we were at the first time, because small changes at the beginning invariably result in large changes at the end. Thus, there is no rational process by which one could adjust the initial conditions in order to assure that we will in fact get conscious beings. Finally, I want to consider the principle of substrate independence. It's the principle that argues that no matter how we implement syntactic relationships, whether they be in neurons, or silicon, or even Chinese radioing each other, standing for each neuron, that we will produce consciousness. This is a principle unlike any found in science. First of all, it's unfalsifiable. Since consciousness is not directly observable except in ourselves, we certainly can't observe it in computers or Chinese populations. Secondly, unlike all of the physics that we know, this is non-local. All physical principles depend on local interactions. What happens here and now is simply a function of the fields and particles that are present here and now. Physics does not care about context. But this principle does care about context because it is looking at the structure as a whole. Thus, there is no analogy between this principle and any principle that we know from normal science. Yet this principle does embody a common form of thinking. It is a form of thinking that was described by James Frazer in his book The Golden Bough and was called by him sympathetic magic. The other examples of it are things like cave paintings. Many anthropologists believe that cave paintings and other drawings of game are a form of magic. Primitive people believed that drawing the form would produce the animal. In the same way, voodoo dolls are another example of sympathetic magic. The idea is that if we stick a pin in something that looks like a human being, we will cause pain in an actual human being. Here the principle is that if we make something that looks like a human brain, it will produce consciousness just like a real human brain. No form of thought other than sympathetic magic is analogous to this principle. So, we may conclude that the principle of substrate independence is simply a form of magical thinking.